report from being released, engagements with the new public protector on the matter, the higher education crisis, the suspicious conduct of the National Prosecuting Authority, and the protection and upholding of the Constitution of South Africa. After the leaders' briefing, we will take a few questions. So without wasting any more time, I'd like to hand you over to our leader, Mmusi Maimane. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here at a very unique time in our nation. As South Africans, we all watched the events unfolding in the last week. And like every South African, we ought to all be seriously concerned about what is taking place in our nation at such a time as this. It's a very unique setting to be here at Lily's Farm because so many people fought for the right to have our constitution. And yet today, that very constitution is under full attack from Jacob Zuma and his cronies. We're here today because we are determined to make sure that the ANC, and more importantly, Jacob Zuma, must in fact be removed. We believe to end this war that is taking place at this current point, and that's why this press conference focuses itself very centrally on the president of our country to say, to safeguard the future of South Africa, Jacob Zuma must do the honorable thing and in fact resign. It's become quite clear to all of us that Jacob Zuma has gone out of all of his actions to capture the state. Often we discuss state capture as a function of the Guptas having captured the state. But what is in fact true is that the Guptas have captured Jacob Zuma, who as a result has captured the state. This has been made even more apparent by the divisions that are now taking place in the ANC, and I support what the Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa has said, which is to say this is clearly a government at war with itself. So fellow South Africans, if we are in fact to resist the incorporation, we must, all of us, resist the incorporation into Zuma Inc., and that those who oppose Jacob Zuma now face the state institutions who are loyal to Jacob Zuma. All of this occurs while we face a very serious economic situation in South Africa. 9 million of our fellow South Africans are without work and certainly without hope. The gap between the rich and the poor is becoming even wider and more epitomized by the fact that all of this is taking place while our higher education institutions are literally on fire. Governing in the interests of the people has become a distant concern for Jacob Zuma. And in fact, he's dashing the hopes and ruining the prospects of these very millions of South Africans, and more specifically, even those black South Africans. I reiterate, for South Africa to navigate its way out of this crisis, in the face where there's a government escalating a war with itself, we need the right leadership at the helm of our country. Jacob Zuma has failed to provide that needed leadership, and he'll not do so in the next coming weeks or months, or certainly in the future of this country. He remains a critical and a single most important impediment to our country's success. That's why, never before, the call for him to step down must be joined by South Africans from all walks who say he is unfit to become the President of the Republic. For South Africa to move forward, Jacob Zuma must go. We call on all of those in our country who love the Constitution to stand together and echo the plea for Jacob Zuma to resign, or if the ANC still has any of the heritage of the group of men who served our country at this time and were certainly from here, if any of them still exists, they must do the honorable thing and recall Jacob Zuma. For ANC MPs and cabinet ministers who reserve their outrage in selective quotes in Sunday papers, they must make their voices heard when it matters most, and they must join us in this call for Jacob Zuma to go. It's in this regard, there are a number of actions that we'll be taking in the next while. The first is that we are going to be tabling a motion in Parliament for debate to ensure that that motion debates whether Parliament can do its job in support of national treasury and ensuring that we fight corruption. The role of Parliament is absolutely critical because it is the apex of accountability in our nation. And if we fail to have a working Parliament, we also allow the project of state capture, as envisaged by Jacob Zuma, to then continue further to Parliament. So, therefore, while Jacob Zuma has a battle for complete executive control in the National Treasury, and the pursuit that without his hands on the purse string, he's unable to hand out patronage on the scale that he desires and push through projects which will benefit those of his friends and his families and his cronies. Therefore, we want to prevent National Treasury from being incorporated into Zuma Inc. And therefore, this becomes a matter of national importance, which should be supported by all those South Africans who want to protect our constitution and root out corruption. As elected people to the Assembly in South Africa, Parliament has its role to play in this regard. On too many occasions, due to the ANC's cowardly support for the executive, this institution has found itself on the side of corruption and accountability rather than on what Parliament must stand for, which is the apex of accountability. This certainly must come to an end. And so at the earliest opportunity, this motion will be tabled in Parliament to ensure that Parliament holds itself accountable, so that those ministers who stand on the side of the defense of Treasury will have an opportunity to give expression to this motion, and that in fact we can ensure that Parliament does its job at protecting the resources that South Africa so desperately needs. I also want to highlight the fact that in the nature of the report, even on state capture, that Baleka Mbete has acted fundamentally in the interests of the executive rather than in the interests of South Africa. She must think as the Speaker of the National Assembly rather than thinking as chairperson of the ANC. This goes further to say the ANC chief whip, if he's serious about the actions that he wants to take rather than just simply being a commentator on the media, he will ask his caucus to support this motion and that members will be able to vote accordingly. I also want to bring to South Africans the fact that on the 2nd of November, we'll also support the march, along with many South Africans from civil society who've been making contact with us. I certainly know from a number of ministers who've made contact and said we want to express and be part of the national march that will be taking place on the 2nd of November. This is symbolically a place that we believe that the role of our judiciary, as far as the courts are concerned, must be able to properly adjudicate what seems like a very suspicious charge brought against the Minister of Finance, Pravin Gordhan. These charges, nevertheless, clearly demonstrate that this is a government at war with itself, making institutions of state used for the purpose of score settling. The DA also has taken the decision, therefore, that we'll call upon all South Africans, those who are concerned about the nature and the state of South Africa, to be in Pretoria on the 2nd of November. We all need to stand together in this time of crisis. South Africans must be reassured that there exists the political determination to protect our country from the internal machinations of the ANC and those bent on destroying key institutions of the state to destroy South Africa, but rather to protect Jacob Zuma. Moving on to the matter of the release of the state capture report. On the 1st of November, the DA will be in court as the party with local standing on this matter. Jacob Zuma's attempts to once again frustrate the work and the office of the Public Protector and do whatever he can to prevent the report of state capture being made public proves that he's in fact got something very serious to hide. And I don't need to go into the Sunday Times report today about the number of questions that he's failed to respond to. But it's become quite clear that Jacob Zuma is using his proxies to interdict, and Des van Rooyen's interdict to be heard on the 1st of November will therefore be a defining moment in protecting our Chapter 9 institutions and ensuring that the first steps are taken to push back the wave of state capture which the President has facilitated. It is in this regard our legal team, and in fact I've got the draft documents which will be tabled this week, that as a party we want to put our position to become an intervening party in the matter to be heard in the North Gauteng High Court. We will argue strongly that the report must be released as a matter of urgency and that it must be made public. The courts have been clear in both the Motswaneng and the Nkandla matter that the Public Protector's report can be taken on review for those who are concerned. This should be the only recourse available to the President, his Gupta friends, and those ministers who have a clear, strong allegiance to both. So we are there in court to request the assurance that the state capture report will be released by the new Public Protector. You'll also note the fact that she's gone on record before and said that she did not believe that the report on state capture may be the top priority of her office. I welcome the fact that she's subsequently changed her mind. It doesn't change the fact that that report is a critical one. And to this regard, we are doing everything we can with our legal team to ensure that it is public and it is released as a matter of urgency. We'll also seek assurances from the new Public Protector that the report will be tabled before Parliament and made public once the courts have made their ruling on this matter. In the view of the bombshell that Minister Gordhan expressed in court papers made public today, it's obvious that the report is of public interest and must see the light of day for those who are implicated must be held accountable. The third matter that we want to speak on is the fact that there's a clear, and this is a project that has been going on for a while, the politicization of the National Prosecuting Authority, and this acts as a serious threat to our democracy. The timing and the nature of the charges that were brought against Minister Gordhan and by extension even Julius Malema have left all of us as South Africans deeply concerned. An impartial and an independent prosecuting authority is the backbone of a functional constitutional democracy where the principle of the rule of law must be respected and upheld. While in the case of both individuals, they may very well have a case before our courts, one cannot ignore the suspicious nature of the timing, the contemplative delayed tactics being used by the NPA, and ultimately the fact that it is selective prosecution in that they have failed to charge Jacob Zuma for the 783 charges of fraud, corruption, money laundering, and racketeering. We fought this case for years to say Jacob Zuma must have what he's always wanted to have, his day in court. It's therefore unreasonable that Sean the Sheep, or the head of the National Prosecuting Authority, fails in fact to act in charging Jacob Zuma. We must, as a nation, be extremely worried when the Minister of Finance expresses publicly that he has no faith in the National Director of Public Prosecution, Sean Abrams, to give him a fair hearing. And fellow South Africans will not certainly sit down while the assault of such valuable institutions continues under Jacob Zuma. My colleague and dear Chief Whip, John Steenhuisen, has requested that there must be a debate of public importance in this matter. Again, I want to urge the ANC Chief Whip to end his selective outrage and support our call. It's in fact time that Parliament to call Sean Abrams and the NPA to account for their actions. I've also asked my office to collate all criminal charges which has been submitted to the South African Police. We will follow up on all of those charges through written questions to Parliament to ascertain why, while the NPA thinks that some cases are more important and others are not. We also want to reaffirm the fact that our clarion call is that we must ensure that there's an independence of the National Prosecuting Authority, and therefore we'll be putting together, we'll be retabling the private members bill drafted by the late Dean Smuts. This private members deal seeks to say that the appointment of the National Director of Public Prosecution should not be a matter left exclusively to Jacob Zuma or the President. It should be a matter where Parliament can exercise its role in appointing the National Director of Public Prosecution. The NPA, of course, has been given a golden opportunity to show that they are capable of acting without fear or favor by dropping their costly litigation opposing. In fact, they must act by dropping their costly litigation opposing the reinstatement of the 783 charges of corruption against Jacob Zuma and proceed with prosecuting the President as they have been instructed to do so by the courts. The last matter I want to address myself on is the continued crisis on higher education. South Africa's higher education is in fact on the brink of collapse. Should this particular academic year not be completed, the knock-on effect on our economy, on our important sectors such as healthcare, and on graduating matriculants across the country will in fact be catastrophic. It is evident for all to see that those who continue to advocate for campus shutdowns are not animated by a desire to help poor students. The destruction and violence which we have witnessed in the last few weeks are acts of thugs and criminals, perhaps, and not of young aspiring leaders. We again call on all students to demonstrate their support for the reopening of our universities. They must reject the blatant disregard for our law and constitution demonstrated by a small group of violent students who are in fact and rather we should all stand together to ensure that our campuses are safe so that learning can recommence. As many of you know, my colleagues, Professor Bazoli, has tabled the DA's alternative funding model to ensure that students are able to get the adequate funding that they need to complete their studies. So to this end, the DA has launched a direct campaign to engage with students and young South Africans around our proposal to reopen universities and ensure that no poor student is denied an education because they cannot afford to study. This will involve us, in fact, directly communicating with students using various platforms, pamphlets, social media, and other technology available. On campuses across South Africa, DASO have launched their campaign to identify poor students who qualify for NSFAS, but who have remained unfunded. The DA is thus committed to closing down the loopholes in support of those students and want to have their voices heard peacefully. Vice-chancellors must do with the right funding support from government, must now do everything possible to ensure that lost time is made up. We encourage civil society, the private sector, and parents to be able to assist them in doing so. We also urge vice-chancellors to make their case clear of their intention to open universities tomorrow. Let the failed UCT approach of endless negotiations with a small group of students who simply don't care about the future of our country be a lesson to be learned in this regard. As the official opposition, the DA will ultimately be doing its part in Parliament to ensure that more funding is made available. We've already tabled practical and affordable solutions to this issue of higher education funding. The midterm budget policy statement is a key opportunity to make funding available. There are many key departments who have wasteful expenditure that these should be cut from to ensure that money is deviated towards the appropriate funding of students and higher education in general. Following the table of the budget, the DA will in fact closely study all line items and then proceed to make the amendments so that funding is in fact made available for higher education. Previously, we were able to identify an additional 2.2 billion rands for higher education, but this was blocked by the ANC caucus. If the ANC is true to act in accordance with its newfound enthusiasm for parliamentary accountability, once again, we call on them to join us in supporting the amendments to the budget. If they do so, they will again, if they don't do so, they will again be shown to be more concerned with party politics than in fact putting South Africa first and helping poor students. On the day of the tabling of the midterm budget statement, we've made a decision that the DA will be marching to Parliament to ensure that our voice is heard for the students who have been silenced by the violence of a few individuals. But we want to make sure that that voice is heard, that we demand that poor students cannot be left behind and that government must do whatever it can to in fact assist in bringing funding for higher education. And in this regard, I call upon all South Africans, those who will be in the Western Cape, in religious fraternity, that we must descend upon Parliament on the day of the tabling of the midterm budget statement to ensure that our voice is heard collectively, that we want for our universities to be open, that no poor students will be left behind, and that in fact we want higher education that achieves the objectives of our economy to grow. We remain confident that the people of this country have shown resolve and that will not stand back and allow our hard-won freedoms to be trampled over. We are a country that overcomes challenges, that have overcome many challenges, and this place is very symbolic of that. And we will do it again. I invite all South Africans who share love for our country to join hands so that we can, as a united group of South Africans, stand up to Jacob Zuma's state capture and corruption and protect our very crucial and important constitutional democracy. I thank you.
Thank you, Leader. We'll take a couple of questions. I think let's take 5. If you can just remember if you media house and your name, and then after that we'll take another round and see how far we go. Thank you. I see 3 hands here in the front. Let's start with you, Goli, because I saw your hand go up first.
Thank you. Calling down from eNCA. Quick question of clarity on the motion that is going to be tabled by the DA in Parliament. Is this yet another motion of no confidence in President Jacob Zuma? And if so, what hope is there that it's going to succeed this time around? Because we've seen it being thwarted time and again.
And the second one,
are you not playing into ANC factional battles when you say you're going to be marching on the 2nd of November? Because clearly, as you say, the ANC is divided with the core faction supporting President Ramaphosa and another, that is with the side of President Jacob Zuma. Are you not playing into their own factional battles by marching? The EFF has also said they're marching. The next question, are you not playing into the factional battles? And lastly, when will you actually be taking on a huge mass action against President Zuma rather than just pushing motions of no confidence? Because the ANC seemingly has the numbers in Parliament to crush any motion that will be put forward. Thank you.
My question is on clarity about the march on the day of the tabling of the midterm budget. It's for poor students and who else. My second question is also regarding fees must fall. What's your view of how things have panned out? Some have criticized the police for being heavy-handed, and some have, as you've mentioned, criticized the protesting students. What's your take on the heavy-handedness of the police as well as?
Okay. Let me take those questions. Polly, this is not a motion of no confidence. We want to table a motion that says, how do we defend Treasury in this regard? Because it's immaterial what the ANC's factional battles are. Treasury is a critical institution of the state and the functioning of South Africa. The Minister of Finance simply is the custodian or acts. But that institution is a critical one. And our view is that all of the machinations that are taking place are Jacob Zuma's action in trying to gain access to treasury. Now, Parliament and fellow South Africans, we can't sit back and allow that to happen. Because these things are masked in a multiplicity of different ways, and some of them have to do with the nuclear deal, etc. But we simply cannot give access to Jacob Zuma to have custodianship over treasury, whilst we can't simply afford the projects that he even wants to bring through. Therefore, the motion is focused on that. And our call simply says this: you can't now, ANC members and deputy president, etc., stand up and say you are actually defensive or you defend treasury. But in fact, when it matters that in Parliament we must stand together and vote in defense of treasury, that you refuse to do so. So this is a crucial intervention to make sure that Parliament in fact does its job. It can't think on the basis of factional battles. It must think on the basis of the interests of South Africa. And that is the fight that we want to bring forward. So we are calling on everybody in Parliament, particularly members of Parliament, that on the day they must face the choice. Either you support Jacob Zuma's project of state capture, or you are actually interested in protecting treasury and the economic outputs of South Africa. That's the choice the motion wants to put forward. As for that Jacob Zuma must fall, which brings me to the next question. Of course, there is a call that says Jacob Zuma must fall. The removal of a president takes place in multiple formats. The most obvious one is that Parliament can vote and exercise its rights to remove a president. And I still maintain, in fact, without doubt, that the removal of Jacob Zuma will bring a stop to this project of state capture. We know that the ANC itself has been captured by Jacob Zuma. So therefore, they won't be able to do what is required of them in an honorable manner at a time such as this one. So that is the one option. And Koli is correct. We've explored that option. But it became quite clear that the ANC and Jacob Zuma are one. Which then brings me to the most crucial point, which South Africa exercised their right electorally to say we'll vote out Jacob Zuma. And it's a call upon all South Africans. They did it in the local government elections when they made a choice to vote for change. And when it comes to the elections coming up now, South Africans must be clear that in fact this is an organization that has been captured, that no longer has their interests at heart, and therefore fundamentally they need to come out and stand electorally to say we vote out Jacob Zuma and co. So that remains our stance. We are not playing into anyone's faction. That's why I say that even the perceived sense of factionalism, you can see its counter evidence when people are willing to stand behind Jacob Zuma in compromise of principle. Our stance says this, that when we march, we're marching for the safeguarding of the Constitution and the defense of what the Constitution then gives its powers to. For example, the NPA is tasked with particular responsibilities, which is to prosecute without fear or prejudice. Now, when the selective prosecution, you can see that that provision is being undermined. We simply can't sit back as South Africans and say, that must remain. Because all the decisions that Jacob Zuma takes in pursuit of state capture have had profound consequences not only to our economy, but to the confidence that South Africans have in the very essence of the Constitution. Jacob Zuma it's clear, he's violated the Constitution and wants to act outside of it. We are not going to allow that. That's why the march is in place. That's why, in fact, we continue the actions. That's why we've tasked our legal team. And it's becoming expensive, because Jacob Zuma just loots from the taxpayers' money and believes that he has a bottomless pit that comes from you and I so that he can finance his own legal battles. It's time, that's why I hope he steps down so that we can fight him with his own money. But the reality of it is this, is that that's why we ask our legal team to say we're going to go out and oppose Jacob Zuma's actions. When I put the complaint in against state capture, we wanted the report to be tabled. If Jacob Zuma wants to oppose the report, he mustn't interdict it. He must rather wait for the report to be tabled, and he has every court available to him, as is the prescribes of certainly the Judge Skipper's judgment in this regard, that he can go challenge it. But until then, he must allow the report to be tabled. And that the Speaker of Parliament, as soon as this report is out, and the courts have ruled on this matter, must ATC the document so that South Africans can satisfy themselves that these are the actions of the President, and ultimately, as the Public Protector report must come through. Mona, there's no doubt that the higher education is in crisis. It's been a matter that's been going on for a number of weeks now. And it's having dire consequences. As I've outlined here today, without even picking sides, students or police. Let's do a diagnosis of what in fact is happening. Because what is happening is that our universities are not opening. Students are not able to write and finish their exams. That will have profound consequences on the economy of South Africa. It will mean that ultimately, for those who are graduating, we are not going to be able to graduate doctors this year, nurses, teachers, across sectors of the economy. So I cannot in any way support a continued shutdown because of the economic consequences it will have. On the one end, that's the one reality. On the other end is, you can take other countries. In other nations, you can finish matric this year and you have to wait 2 years before you can enter university because of the backlog. So what are we saying to our current crop of matriculants who will graduate now? So there's the higher education crisis is there. Furthermore, as I met with vice chancellors and I met with Adam Habib and the CEO, one of the discussions that we had was, how do they manage to retain professors at these universities? The longer there's a lack of confidence in the system, the more the professors are exiting, which will have dire consequences as to what quality of higher education we want to offer our students. So the march simply says this: the failure of higher education is the fact that progressively over the last number of years, the South African government has failed to disperse funding towards higher education at the appropriate level. We underfund higher education as a proportion of GDP, less in contrast even with our African counterparts. So accountability must sit firmly and squarely on this government for having failed over the last number of years to in fact give financial support to higher education. The march says this. It says we will go to Parliament because this gives us the best opportunity. Parliament has got extraordinary powers which have never been tested because you've got Balega Mbete, whose primary interest is the ANC. If Parliament wanted to do its job, it has to say, the executive, we can amend the budget. And we must use that power given to Parliament to amend the budget so that appropriate funding is given to higher education. So our stance says it's not a march it's a march for higher education, it's a march for all students, it's a march that our universities must be open, and ultimately that we must use this year's budget statement to appropriate funding towards higher education. I also want to say that when it comes to the issue of policing, that in South Africa we think in binary terms. We think if you send police onto campus, you are calling for a Marikana. Nobody is calling for that. South Africans have had a history of protest. Globally, people protest. It's not unique. But it's not to suggest that when you say the police must be present, that they must have escalating levels of violence. There is a manner, and if you follow Judge Falam's report on the Marikana report, one of the key criticisms that came out of that report was to say there is a lack of training around public order policing. We must, because today the protest might be on higher education, tomorrow it might be on something else, it might be on service delivery, or whatever the case might be. South Africans, it's enshrined in our rule of law that they have the right to protest. But not every protest must end violently. And therefore, I call upon all South Africans, and the students have the right to protest. And the police also have the right to do what they are tasked to do, which is to protect institutions, to protect everybody's rights. Therefore, I call upon all the police to exercise restraint to ensure that there's order on campus, because ultimately our objective stems from the fact that we must ensure that higher education opens and functions so that South Africans can, in fact, we can achieve our goal of inclusivity. We set ourselves back as a nation when we burn infrastructure. Whether it's burning schools, whether it's burning libraries, whether it's burning institutions of higher learning, we set ourselves back. The complexity of the task in South Africa requires that we should rather be focused as a nation collectively to building rather than breaking down. And that in fact the failure of the Fees Commission indicates the fact that when South Africans made this call last year, Jacob Zuma made a false promise. The Fees Commission simply has not even tabled a report. And this is a failure. Our call still remains. We must get back to negotiations. We must ensure that universities get back to work. The midterm budget statement must be able to make the allocations. We will be making submissions to this regard so that higher education can function. That's our stance. And ultimately, as I've reiterated, we will always ensure that for poor students, no poor student will be left out of higher education because they are poor. And our budget submissions have made provision for that. But equally so, when a South African is able to fund higher education and pay for it, they must be able to pay for it.
Let's take the second round of questions. Yes, sir. And we will give you another hand. Is that the only two hands? Let's take three. Okay.
I want to overrule you.
Luckily, I'm cheering you. Dada, let's give you
just want to know if you have met as an opposition parties in planning to formulate or you're planning to formulate a common position for general on the state transition. And if so, what is that position?
Again, on the motion, when will it be tabled before Parliament, this motion? The other question is around the new public protector. I'm unclear about whether you are still to engage her or you have engaged her around the state capture report. Could you flesh that out for us? And just lastly, someone might criticize you on this and say, it is what we've been saying all along, that, and I couldn't help but noticing your voice sort of go down on this matter, you saying that you're also going to be calling on South Africans to join the march on the 2nd. The criticism therefore will be, what happens to the DA's original ideas? The EFF has already pronounced this. Why are you simply building on what has already been announced by the EFF? And are you of the same view, like they announced on Thursday, that the businesses in Tshwane must shut down because they can't promise they can't possibly control the crowd? So I guess that the question really is about, where are the DA's original ideas?
Okay.
Sorry, it was a good question. Partially covered by Tony, but the last part is just, are you also resorting to EFF tactics on how to deal with President Jacob Zuma, as you totally devoid of your own ideas and visions of fighting through Parliament, into the courts to get rid of President Jacob Zuma? Are you not taking to the streets in conjunction with equal freedom fighters?
Let me respond. Perhaps maybe take the two together, to Xoli and the respective question. The march was a call by other sectors of society even prior to the EFF's own announcement on the issue, to be fair. It was called by other people. And the march is an opportunity for South Africans to come together. I think to reduce it to an EFF march would be wrong. They have their own agenda. They must drive that agenda. In this particular instance, we have always taken action on the state capture issue. In fact, I would argue the case that this is other parties coming in late. Let me help remind. When this matter was raised initially, I wrote to the public protector to say, I need an investigation on this matter. She wrote back to me to say, of course she'll, and you can recall, she said she will accelerate the report prior to her term of office. That was the thing. Furthermore, we then said to ourselves, not only is this issue, we needed to use Parliament for the purpose of ensuring that state capture is actually debated in Parliament, so that it becomes quite clear on which side of the fence South Africans sit on. And the ANC voted against our motion to have an ad hoc committee established to investigate state capture. We then subsequently said we will wait for the report on state capture to be tabled, because now we have an opportunity to do that. Once that state capture report is then tabled, we then have other avenues, both legal and political, to then take the action forward. So I find it quite amusing often that I hear people say, no, but this, no, it can't be. It's not true. People come to the end of the action and then suddenly they say, no, this was this party's action. It's not. We've always been consistent on our fight against state capture, and we've used multiple avenues to do so. The selective accountability on President Jacob Zuma. We were the first one to say Advocate John Abrams is not fit for the job. We also came out quite clearly and said even Advocate Jiba was not fit to do the job. And it's been a very expensive exercise taking these people to court. There is nothing in there that says to us that we were following anybody. We've always believed in the independence of the National Prosecuting Authority and have fought the battle. Now when other people come in lately and say, hey, no, Sean must go and this must go, we've taken the battle. So they take that report. Let's take the spy tapes case. This has been going on for a number of years. But at every step, we could have abandoned the issue. But we've chosen not to, because it was important for the principle of the rule of law. When people were critical of us, saying, no, but why are you saying to us that, look, you must forget the Zuma issue, it's late, all of that. Well, no, we can't. It's for the purpose of ensuring that the rule of law is in place. And we fought this battle, and in fact, that's why I'm waiting for Jacob Zuma at the Constitutional Court. We will take him on there. Then other people will come and say, charge Zuma. But the battle has been ongoing. In this particular instance, when it comes to this issue of a march, I'm responding to the fact that many South Africans have been calling me, saying, we want to be a part of the march. So I must give them the right to do so. It's like, please, let's be part of that march. But it can't be the only action that we take, surely. It requires us, as I've said to you, now we are opposing Zuma's interdict on the matter. We are taking action in Parliament to ensure that there's accountability on state capture. So we are operating across multiple platforms. The one is about what we do on the ground. The other has been about what we do in the courts. The other is using Parliament, which is a crucial institution. Because you and I can both agree, if we sit back today and say, fine, in the ANC can use majoritarianism to escape accountability, then we must forego Parliament. I think that would be a dangerous day for all of us as South Africans. I think both you and I can agree on that. Parliament must be able to do its job. So, march or no march, I wanted us to be clear about what actions we are taking, legally, politically, and also. And this is not the only march I've pronounced on. We've also called on the march on the midterm budget statement. We'll also make submissions to the budget process to say, here's how we want to manage the budget. I don't see any other party seeking to say, how do we keep this country working? And in answer to the question about whether businesses should shut down on that day, I think businesses must be open. You can't, in the interest of one, undermine the economic output. It can't be so. It cannot be so. It must be an exercise of saying South Africans who want to be a part of it must be a part of it. They must volunteer, they must have the right and the choice to choose whether to participate. But you can't surely be expecting that on the day we're going to break down businesses or shut them down. It will have economic consequences. So we mustn't, in the interest of saying we're going against Zuma, say, no, everything else must be compromised along the way. It can't be. We have a country to build here. To your question about whether or not these are EFF tactics, they are not. The EFF has made it quite clear that they want to make Parliament unworkable. I've fought to make sure Parliament works. We've been at the forefront of making sure that we use our legal system for the purpose of holding those to account. We didn't just take any sideline action when we fought against Nongqobo Jiba. But along with that, it's not a particular party's tactic to say now you must mobilize communities. It's not. It's political work that we do when we go into communities. And when communities say to us we are dissatisfied about this thing, we give voice to that because we are public representatives. So I don't think we must be exclusive in saying this is that or that's that. No, it's not. We fought these battles, we'll continue to fight it, and ultimately those who must be held accountable must be held accountable. In answer to the question about Eric, the motion will be tabled. I think Parliament has a sitting on this week. At the earliest sitting, I think it's on Tuesday. We'll table the motion. Then it's up to the programming committee. It has to be submitted to the programming committee to ensure it then gets debated. And when will be the most ideal time for that?
And the engagement with the new public protector.
And as far as engaging the new public protector is concerned, look, we are only asking her to do a simple thing. Table the report. I don't think it requires further engagement. As soon as the matter has been heard in court, we're asking her to table it. And I, like many others, wanted to prove the fact that, look, she's not put there for the purposes of protecting Jacob Zuma. She must table that report. And noting that, in fact, those who know how to delay these things will seek to oppose, she must stand on the side of saying this report must be made public and whatever recommendations are in place must be implemented. Because as the SCA ruling that came out in the Hlaudi Motswaneng matter, a case we coincidentally fought, it put the fact that, look, the powers of the public protectors must be binding and can only be challenged in a competent court to do so. So she must do her job, is all I'm asking her to do.
Any other questions?
No. There was a question about opposition parties and whether we'll be meeting with them.
The
As far as that, we have. I met with opposition parties around the higher education matter when we met with the vice chancellors, and so that meeting took place and said, here's how we're coming together. When it comes to the question about, we've got another meeting scheduled this week that will then put some of the discussion that you are raising about the midterm budget statement. That will come on board now in the next, I think that meeting is scheduled for during this week. So we'll then be able to meet so that we can outline what the rest of the program is around the midterm budget statement.
I think if there's no more questions, then when they take a final round of questions, then what's that?
Just to follow up again on the march. The DA and the EFF do differ quite vastly ideologically, but we've seen that you can come together. So if that's the case and you're marching for similar reasons, on the 2nd of November, why not join the marches?
Because that's a discussion I haven't had with the EFF. And our key focus is I've got to establish from them what they're seeking at doing about the march. I'm only representing South Africans who've said to us, look, we stand on the side of the economy and making sure that poor South Africans have work, and therefore as a result of that, we'll produce that action going forward. We're not in the interest of picking a side. We're actually in the interest of South Africans. And I think it must be clear, as I've said even in the statement, I'm not even marching for Pravin Gordhan. I'm marching for the principle of the rule of law, that there cannot be selective prosecution. If you want to prosecute South Africans, you must prosecute them all, without fear or prejudice. But once you start selecting who you want to prosecute, for what purpose, then you are playing into the realm of selective prosecution, which cannot be accepted. So So I think we must be clear. I haven't discussed this matter with them.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for giving up your Sundays to be with us. Have a nice day. Really, huh?
Right.